named Destiny's Tot. He was 22 years old in his 13th mission over Ludwigshafen, Germany. Something happened, Bob. Dick, what happened?
Well, evidently we got hit by some flak, and we really didn't think on that day that the flak had been particularly heavy, and we were kind of congratulating ourselves on our way home. And we got just north of Paris, and one of the engines quit running, and we were unable to feather the prop because the oil reservoir had been damaged by flak. And so the crankshaft broke, and we were then flying with an 11-foot brake instead of an 11-foot puller. We were all alone, couldn't keep up with the group, and about 50 miles north of Paris, we got jumped by 6 German fighters. And in 3 or 4 minutes, they totally incapacitated the airplane, and the order was given to bail out. And I'm very proud to say that a friend of mine in France went back and found where everybody landed, and I was the furthest one away. When I hit the ground, I landed where a very elderly French man was farming with a team of oxen and a one-bottom plow. He pointed one way and said, "Comrade." He pointed the other way and said, "Allemand." I didn't know Allemand, but I knew "Comrade," and he was pointing to woods. So I buried my Mae West and my flying boots and the parachute, put them in the trench where he was plowing, and indicated that he should plow over him. I went into the woods and probably 100 yards and did a right turn, and went down along the woods there for quite a while, and went back up to the edge of the woods, and there I could see a hedgerow a little bit further off to the left. So I went back into the woods and went down to where I thought the hedgerow was, and I was pretty lucky because I came out where it ended into the woods, and I kind of half dog trotted down the hedgerow, and I found a nice open spot, and I thought, well, I'll sit here till nightfall. We had been briefed to get out of the immediate area as quickly as possible, and I thought I could get down to a little village that I saw in front of me and maybe catch a train or something. And so I waited there till it was very deep dusk or night, and all of a sudden 4 young Frenchmen came up where I was, and they had a .45 in their hand and motioned for me to come out. And I didn't hesitate. They had a sack of clothes and civilian clothes, and indicated for me to change clothes at that point, which I did. And then we started walking down toward this little village across the field, and they took me to the local sheriff's office, what we would call the sheriff. It wasn't the gendarme because he wasn't in uniform. And they visited quite a while about what they were going to do with me in French, and I was a little curious. But they motioned me for to come outside, and they put me in the trunk of a Peugeot, which is a very, very small car, and I was all folded up in there, and we started off across country. And I don't know, in 20, 25 minutes, I found out later, came to a farmhouse, and I went in, and there I met the radio operator and Bill Boer, the co-pilot. We were very happy to see one another. And they were talking, and one of the people could speak a little English, and she indicated to us that to be quiet because one half of the house was pro-German and the half we were in was pro-Ally. And the man indicated that, would I like a drink? And I said, yes. And so he gave me a water glass with some kind of white liquor in it, and I poured out quite a bit and took a big drink, and I couldn't talk for 20 minutes. It was straight Calvados, which was about 190 proof. Well, we stayed there that night and that day, and the next night they moved us into a town called Saint-Just, which is S-T, capital J-U-S-T, and they moved us into an abandoned house in town. The local man in charge of the Maquis or the underground could speak pretty good English, and we were a novelty in town. And on New Year's Eve, we had a lot of company from the people in the surrounding area, at least the ones they could trust. And they were quite happy, and they were telling us all kinds of stories that we wouldn't be there very long. They'd fly in to get us, and we'd go here and we'd go there. And we didn't think there was any way they were going to fly in to get a staff sergeant and 2 second lieutenants. So, but anyway, his wife, who happened to be a very beautiful young French girl, a good 20 years younger than Captain Jacques, brought us food twice a day. And one day she came, on about the 3rd or 4th day, she came and said, I can't come with food anymore. No, why? Well, my husband says I'm spending too much time here. So the next day he came, and he was rather excited, and he said, you gentlemen are going to have to move. And why? Well, the neighbors see smoke coming out of the chimney of an abandoned house, and they want to know why. So we moved into a very small 1-bedroom home with a brand new, newly married couple called Paul and Yvonne Begg. They had a brand new baby, and the 3 American airmen took turns sleeping in the bed, and Paul and Yvonne must have been sleeping out in the barn in the hay. Yvonne was a super cook, and the food was a little sparse, but it was adequate. And every night we'd be invited out for supper to the doctor's house, to the mayor's house, to somebody else's house. And so we were in Saint-Just for 2 weeks, and one night, the Captain Jacques came by and said, you guys are leaving tomorrow morning. So we walked up into the town of Saint-Just, into the business district, and there was a Frenchman came in like an old Duesenberg, must have been about a 1935 model or something, 7-passenger, and he was the roughest looking man I ever saw in my life. They gave Captain Jacques had taken all of our dog tags, and so we had absolutely no identification. So he gave each one of us a .45, and he said, if the Germans stop you, start to shoot and run. Well, we were going into Paris with this man in the car, and as luck would have it, we pulled up to a railroad station with a long, slow freight going by. And alongside of us came a German staff car with about 4 German officers and their driver in it. And, you know, to this day, I can't figure out why when they saw 4 young men in this old crate of a car with a driver, somebody didn't get out and want to ask a question. But we got by that one and we drove into Paris, and our driver was lost. And he drove around, and it was getting toward dusk and curfew, and so he finally stopped and got on a telephone, and we went out by the Arc of Triumph, and we were delivered to a very small apartment with a delightful little old English lady who'd been caught during the war and was not able to get back to England. And so she said, you know, I'd really like to keep you 4 men here, but obviously you can't stay in this apartment. 2 of you are going to have to leave. Well, when we left San Jose, we picked up the ball turret gunner who had been shot in the thigh, and he was pretty well healed up, but he was still limping, so it was very apparent that he wasn't going to be able to walk a couple of miles, and the co-pilot was still a little shook, and he wasn't going to walk. So the radio operator and I started off, and we were following a man who had a newspaper in his coat pocket, and we were told he walked on one side of the street, we walked on the other side of the street. And he said, when he crosses the street and walks through a door, you walk right in behind him. And it was a pretty interesting walk. Paris was fairly well filled up with German soldiers, and you know, you bump them going down the sidewalk and couldn't talk. So anyway, we got to this house, this apartment building, and we were met by Alphonse and his wife. And we were taken up 5 flights of stairs and said, well, this is where you'll stay. And Alphonse could speak good English. And he said, be quiet up here. He said, you'll get 2 meals a day. You get breakfast and supper. And he says, on the 3rd floor, the Germans officers have requisitioned that whole floor. And so, you know, don't make any noise up here. So the second night we were there, we were down, and this lady's, like, her kitchen and dining room and living room and everything was on the ground floor of we found out later it was the Canadian Pacific building that had been abandoned or given over during the war. And we were sitting around the table, and there was a knock on the door, and the lady opened the door, and there's a German soldier. And I thought, oh, you know, what the hell? So they talked back and forth a bit, and we found out later that he was asking, you know, who their guests were. Well, we were from the south of France. We were in Paris for a little vacation, and so he went about his business, and from that day on, every night the lady had a party. I eventually figured out that she must have been a Jewess married to a Frenchman, and she'd go out 2 days a week into the country and buy absolutely fantastic food on the black market. I've never eaten quite so good in all my life. And then, because she had the money to buy the black market food, she'd invite all of her friends in. And that was very nice, because we were drinking a lot of good wine, we were eating bread and good butter and cheese and meat and the whole bit. The days were a little long, but the nights were fun. And I don't know whether anybody will know it, but a very famous French female entertainer was a friend, and her name was Miss Danguette. And she would stop in at night and say hello and wondering about the party and the people and one thing and another. And so one night after we'd been there about a week or so, the party was a little raucous and the wine was flowing pretty good, and the German soldier showed up right on schedule to get his coffee beans ground. And about half of the females that were around the table were wearing the Star of David. They had to wear it. It had to be visible at all times. And so this one Jewish lady that was sitting next to me started talking to this German soldier. And she was agitated, and he was getting a little agitated. And I thought, you know, what the hell is she doing talking to this German soldier? She got nothing to do with him. So after he left and was gone a little bit, I said to Alphonse, I said, you know, what was the deal there? And he said, well, that lady was telling that German soldier that as soon as the American airmen got here, they were going to put the run on the German army and you'd be gone. And his retort to her was, you know, that's just fine. I'd sooner be home anyway, which is pretty typical of the average GI. Well, after we'd been in Saint-Just for 2 weeks and in Paris for 2 weeks, one morning a delightful young woman came up to our apartment and shook me and said, hurry up and get dressed, you're leaving. And while I was getting dressed, she tried to talk Al Mealy, the radio operator, into staying on and working with the underground, doing radio work for him, and he said no thanks. So she took me down to the train station, and at the train station, another young man came up, and he had all my papers. I had a discharge from the French Army. I had work papers to go to Germany. I was a French geologist. I had papers to go up on the coast because I was going up to inspect the fortifications, the breastwork and stuff for the coming invasion. And so they said, as soon as they get on the train and leave the station, go back into the men's room and make them look as old and dirty and worn as possible. And here's a newspaper, and you read the newspaper and you don't talk to anybody. Well, the French trains, you know, they had the aisle alongside, and then the compartments were not in the middle like the US train. And so I got in the corner near the window and started to read the paper, and the compartment filled up, as did the whole train. And the French are gregarious, and they wanted to find about something about me or whatever. And during that train trip, which took all day, there were 3 or 4 changes of passengers, and I was offered wine and bread and cheese. And they must have thought, you know, what a knothead that guy is. So I got off the train at Saint-Brieuc, and I had been told to wait for a little narrow gauge train that would come through town, and to get on the train. And when a young lady with a knee-length leather coat and knee-high rubber boots got off the train, I was to get up and follow her. So, like the other trains, that train was full and made all the stops down along the coast. And soon I saw this girl coming that fit the description, and so I got up, and lo and behold, there were 5 other young guys got up and followed her. So here we are, the 6 of us, following this young gal down along the railroad track and into her house. That train that I'd come up on had at least 5 more Allied airmen that were evading capture. So when we were up on the coast at a little town called Plua, which is just out of Saint-Brieuc up in the Brest Peninsula, we found out that they were in nightly contact with the BBC, and the code word was "Good evening to the house of Alphonse." And if that came on again at the 10 o'clock news, that meant that the British Navy was on the way to get us. If it didn't come on, it signified that they weren't coming. Well, the first night they couldn't come because it was too windy. And so the second night, they said, okay, we've got to go. So they took the 6 of us and moved us to another gathering point, which was the home, the house of Alfred. And the total group was 25. We had a RAF pilot from Rhodesia that was on the run with us. We had a guy named Val Williams, who was a very important French resistance. He was on the run from the Gestapo because he'd been in prison and had gotten out. And we had a Russian tank commander. And nobody could figure out how that Russian tank commander got that far west. But when Val Williams went over the fence to get out of the prison, he hurt his knee, and so this Russian kid picked him up and carried him until they got to the contact house. So anyway, we walked down to the beach, and they walked us through barnyards and pigsties so there would be no scent for the dogs to follow, because the Germans with their dogs patrolled the whole upper level of the beach. And so then we came to where we were going down the beach, and this beach cliff was, you know, like right straight up and down about 50, 60 feet. And as we were walking, they said, put your one hand on the guy ahead of you on your shoulder so that nobody gets separated. So we had a little trouble getting our ball turret gunner down the cliff. But so now we are in the caves, back out of the wind, and we're waiting for a signal to come. And pretty soon the rumor came that the British were out waiting for us, and they were coming in with the boats. Well, we strained a little and we could hear, and the boats came in, but they turned around and went back. Well, then the rumor was that the first 2 boats that came in, they were rowboats, that they didn't bring any money. They only brought food and clothes and medicine and that kind of stuff. And so then they came back in, and as a matter of fact, it was colder than hell, so I helped row the boat out. And we climbed up over the side of this motor gunboat, and sitting right where we came up over the gunwale, here's a guy sitting behind a machine gun. I thought that wasn't a very good welcome, but anyway, they said kept going. So we went down in like where the galley was, and they fed us a bowl of real salty bean soup. And then they put us down, I don't know what you'd call it, but it must have been something for cruise quarters, because we were about 3 high in bunks. And it was rougher than old Billy Get Out. And they put a couple of wash tubs down on the floor. And all these guys would be hanging out of their bunk trying to hit that tub going by, irping. And I swear to God, my co-pilot and I were the only 2 guys in that 25 that didn't get sick. It is the worst mess I ever saw in my life. And it was so rough that you'd feel the bow of the boat go into a wave, but when it came up and it slammed down again, the screws would come out on the back. And so it wasn't a very pleasant ride. And we got back to Plymouth, and we were offloaded, and all our clothes were taken away from us, and we were put in British infantry clothes and put on a train to go into London, where we were debriefed for 2 or 3 days. And the first day I was there, one of them said, well, how are you? And I said, well, I want to tell you, I'm lousy as hell. I itch everywhere. They always said, I think we can fix that. So that night he said to Bill Boer, he said, take this powder and you cover him with the powder from his head to his feet, everywhere. Because he said, if you don't get rid of the crabs, then we're going to have to shave you. And when I got out of bed the next morning, I want to tell you that sheet was literally black with those little buggers. And I'd been sleeping with my radio operator for the better part of 3 weeks. And he never got crab one. He had nice oily skin, and the crabs didn't like him, but they sure did like me. So then we left London and went back out to our bomb group base, put a sign on the bulletin board saying that we were back, and please return our clothes, because the standard operating procedure was when a crew went down, the quartermaster would come and take a dress uniform, go through your mail, throw in a few mementos, and send that back to your parents. And all your other stuff would be requisitioned by your fellow flyers. And the only thing I lost was I had a really good watch, and somebody had taken the watch and traded me a perpetual Rolex. But I got most of my socks and my underwear and that kind of stuff back. So they gave us an airplane so we could do some flying and get our flying pay worked back up. And so we flew around England for a couple hours, and then we went back into London. And after a couple days, they scheduled us out on a C-54 to go home. And we found out that we were only allowed 50 pounds of baggage per each. So I took my 2 enlisted men into the men's room and said, you guys take all your clothes, all your GI clothes, and throw them over there in the waste paper basket, and Bill Boer and I are going to take up your weight with our officers' uniforms. And I said, when we get back to the U.S., I'll get you all a brand new set of first-class garb. And that worked out. We got back to New York City, and I got them all decked out in some nice, fresh uniforms to go home in. And I went home for a month, wound up going back. Well, I went to Atlantic City, and I hung around there for a few days, and you had to talk to a psychiatrist before you could get back. And so he said to me, he said, well, Lieutenant, how are you doing? And I said, well, I don't know. I said, where are they sending people like me now when I leave here? And well, he says the last group was going down to Texas. And I said, well, you know, I haven't been sleeping very good. I'm having bad dreams. It's not going very good. Well, we'll send you down to Lake Lure, North Carolina for 2 weeks. So I got back from there and went back to see him, and found out they were sending people down to Florida, and I thought that was pretty good. So I said, well, I'm ready to go back on active duty. So I spent the rest of the war flying gunners, chasing girls, and I had a good time in Florida. I had a chance to sign up to go to work for Eastern Airlines, and I qualified for that. So I spent a few months flying for Eastern Airlines, and by the time the war was over out in the Pacific, I knew I didn't want to live in New York City the rest of my life. So I went down to see the operations officer and explained my situation, and he said, well, I got a stack 2 feet high of people like you who want a job. So he said, if you want to go back to school, fine. So I went back to Notre Dame and finished up a 1.5 years and went back out in the country where I belong, got married, raised some kids, and the rest is history.
Richard, you missed one little spot that I know about you.
Okay.
And it's sort of interesting, not that it's historically interesting, but as you were parachuting down,
Oh, okay.
Tell us about that.
All right. So, well, the other thing they'd been briefed to do was, you know, delay your opening your parachute so you weren't in the parachute so long that they could have a reception committee for you when you landed. So I'm falling all tucked up and I go through a cloud bank. And I can remember it very well today. I thought, by God, if this runs all the way to ground, I am in a world of hurt. So I pulled the parachute, popped open. So I'm hanging there, and it's very, very quiet in the parachute. You'd be surprised how quiet it can get. And all of a sudden, I heard this airplane, and I saw this guy coming with a FW-190, and I thought to myself, you don't suppose that dirty bugger is going to shoot me, do you? So he got right up pretty close to me, and he tipped up on one wing, and you know, I could almost see his facial features, and he waved. And so I thought to myself, well, hell, if you're not mad, I'm not mad either, so I waved back. And then in just a couple of minutes, I was on the ground and on the run. That's
Now,
about it.
That's what I wanted to hear, Dick. And now give me your thoughts about the helpers.
Well, it goes without saying, without the helpers, at my particular time, as did 3 of my enlisted men, we'd have spent 18 months in a prison camp at the best. You know, at the worst, if you might have got crossways with some German Gestapo somewhere and they eliminated them. The thing about the French, the story I like to tell to my friends out in the country is that if somebody you knew really well came to your house along about midnight and rapped on the door and said, I've got 1 or 2 young men here who, you know, are no threat to you, except that if you get caught with them, you're going to get shot, your wife's going to get shot, and probably your kids too. Now, will you take them in? And not all of them did, but a big percentage of them did. And a lot of them, a lot of the people on the ground would take people like me into their house and feed them for supper. And some of them would say, I'm sorry you can't stay. Some would say, well, you can go out and stay hid in the barn. And from what I know, maybe 15–20% wouldn't get help. They were scared. I don't blame them for being scared. And the rest of them were willing to take a chance. And it was, you know, it was mostly the young people who were more willing to take a chance than some of the older. The older people would, if you found a farmer out in the field or something, just like that guy, he told me which way to go. An older couple, if you met them out in a farm, might take you and hide you someplace, but whoever came to get you would be young, not much older than we were, middle 20s. And they took some hell of a risks. As a matter of fact, the young lady that came to get me in Paris, 6 weeks later, she was apprehended by the Gestapo, and they made a vegetable out of her. Delightful woman, spoke beautiful English, good looking. You'd be happy to take her home to meet your mother anytime. But they just really beat the hell out of her and screwed up her mind, screwed up her body. And so the people that got caught really paid the price. And so that's the reason, one of the reasons for AFIs. And what our motto is, we will never forget. And we're very, very good to all of those people that helped us. And you know, it's not just the guy that would, or the couple that would take into your house. It had to be all the other people. Somebody who was stealing papers. Somebody was stamping papers at the Gestapo headquarters. Somebody had to arrange food. Somebody had to arrange transportation. You know, it was a whole network of people that helped. Somebody said, well, you know, how many people help you? I don't have a clue. You know, it might have been 500 by the time it all got spread out. So, you know, I really don't know how many people did help me. So, but, and the same was true with the helpers in Holland and Belgium, and the guys down in the Balkans too. A lot of my friends in the 15th, they didn't have as good going as we did because those people down there didn't have anything. They didn't have anything to eat, didn't have anything to wear. Whereas up in Northern Europe, that's the same thing. If you were out in the country, you lived a lot better than the people did in the city. And so, you know, I was happy. If it had to happen, I was happy where it happened.
Well, Dick, that was one heck of a great interview, and I want to thank you so much.
Well, you're more than welcome. It was my pleasure.
I have one question.
We're speaking now with Alfred Lee. He was a navigator on a B-17. The B-17 name was the BTO, meaning Big Time Operator, and the ETO, meaning European Theater of Operations. He was 24 years old, and on his 7th mission, January 21st?
June
21st, 1944, over Ruhlen, Germany.
That was our target.
That was their target. He ran into a little bit of trouble. How about it, Alfred? Tell us about it.
We left the target and were heading for our base in Russia, which was at Poltava. We were accompanied by escort fighters of P-51s, and it was decided that it might be interesting if we took off from course and flew over Warsaw, because they hadn't seen any Allied planes since the start of the war. We found out later there were riots in the street. The people went crazy when 75 B-17s flew over and P-51 escorting. All of this time we had been followed by a huge German airplane that stayed approximately 3 to 4 miles away, maybe 5, but kept our altitude, airspeed, and this sort of thing, and we found out later, was constantly keeping us in touch with German fighter bases where we were headed. And all of a sudden, all hell broke loose in eastern Poland. And our plane was our B-17 was the only bomber shot down on the entire mission. Lieutenant Frank Sibbitt, a P-51 pilot, endeavored to protect us hanging in our parachutes. At that time, the Germans were shooting Allied forces when they were in their chutes. He was killed trying to protect us. All 7 of us escaped capture by the Germans. We landed safely. The other 3 were injured more seriously and were captured by the Germans. We were picked up immediately by the 34th Regiment, Army Krajowy, Home Army, AK. The most wonderful soldiers you would ever want to meet in all your life, operating with just guns that they had saved and hidden from the Germans after the 1939 debacle, and ammunition and guns that they had captured subsequently from Germans. And we immediately were taken care of with and joined up with them and acted as infantrymen for 40 days before we were finally overrun by Russian troops. These were the Russians that were advancing on Warsaw. At that time, the Germans were trying to annihilate all the Jewish people in the ghetto. The Russians told us at that time through our interpreter that they were waiting and letting the Germans do more of their work. And of course the Russians had no love for the Poles either. But in any event, we were finally wound up in Russian hands. In the meantime, we had been involved in all sorts of exciting things. The Poles had no fear of anybody. We met a Polish Air Force major, and we occupied a farmhouse where we could watch a German air base for 4 days, I think 3-4 days. He provided us with training manuals and flight manuals for German Ju-88s, and we had enough troops in the regiment, now swelled to probably 300, to take over the German Air Force base, and we would steal, the 2 planes would be readied by friendly Polish people on the base. We would take these planes, and I had plotted the course to fly them out over Danzig and over Sweden into England. And it was finally given up, the idea. It just didn't seem sensible to risk that many lives just for 7 fellows to steal 2 airplanes and go back to England. Subsequently to that, we had more excitement. The RAF dropped some plastic explosive, which was relatively new. And one afternoon, we planted it on railroad tracks, and from hidden places blew up a German supply train. Well, needless to say, the Germans didn't appreciate that kind of stuff in a country that was occupied by their troops. And they chased us, and well, it was about, I would have to say 24 hours, from maybe a little less. We marched through woods and dirt roads, almost 45 miles. And on the way we stopped. There was a big farmhouse then that would be like a Texas ranch, sort of, but it was a dairy farm. And the Germans occupied it, and they were using it to get milk and raise cattle. And they were all, we could hear them playing cards and laughing and drinking up in the farmhouse. And there were about 20 of us. And while this is going on, 2 of the fellows snuck up into the dairy barn and got one of the cows out and marched it down the road, and we stole away in the darkness. And finally, we passed another little German Air Force base there and found a dark spot in the woods, and we butchered this poor milk cow. We were hungry for beef, and of course we had visions of steaks and that, but to feed 300 men on 1 milk cow, it wound up being stew. There's a ton more of things that I could tell you that would go on. I could talk all night.
I bet you could, Alfred, but
I understand the limits of this thing, and
No, we have some more time, but the helpers that you had helping you evade the Germans, tell us about those.
The Polish infantry was organized with the merest amount of weapons and ammunition, what they could find and confiscate. Was their word was requisition. If in English, we must requisition. They had actually, this regiment had German occupation money plates to print their own money. And each man reserved a certain amount of money every month. Of course, there wasn't much they could buy with it, but they could get a few things like razor blades or cigarettes, that sort of thing. And but they were very self-sufficient. We had a radio, I think I told you previously, we had a radio man that had been trained in Great Britain, and the RAF dropped him with equipment, and his equipment included a bicycle that had a generator mounted on the frame that you could flip the sprocket that would normally drive the wheel and turn the generator on and power the radio transmitter. And they were in touch with the Polish headquarters in London. And the very night that we were shot down, they sent a message to London, alerting London that we had been taken care of and that we were in their hands safe, and name, rank, and serial number. But in spite of that, we were reported to our families as missing in action, and some action it was. When our plane went down, I think of my pilot always, God bless his soul. He was the last man out of the plane, and we had 2 engines on fire, number 2 and number 3. And in holding the plane by himself, with his feet on the instrument panel, he was so small he sat on 2 cushions to see out. It tore his right arm out of the socket at the shoulder. And we were in this little village of maybe 5 to 10 houses, and they fed us that night. And this Polish doctor, he must have been about 55 or 60, walked about 5 kilometers to come and help. Well, he didn't have any medication, and he gave Louis a shot of vodka and a stick to hold between his teeth, and he put him on the ground beside a tree stump and put one foot up against Lou's right ear and the other one in his armpit, and he took and pulled on his arm until he could stretch that torn joint and let it back in. Well, you never heard such a horrendous sound in all your life when that arm popped back in. This is the kind of spirit these people had. They were absolutely fearless. And after we blew up the train, I forgot the funniest thing. We were in this forest the next morning, and they came around, this Polish movie director that could speak English. He said, "Boys, you must come for parade today." We had no idea what was in their mind, this little village. And here were the troops all lined up. Well, what is all this about? Don't you know it's the 4th of July, your national holiday? And we had this parade, reviewed the troops, and this was all within 3 miles of the German Gestapo headquarters for that district. So that just is a small segment of 40 days of excitement, like a Hollywood movie with live ammunition. We were many times surrounded by Germans and thought that the end had come. I can remember one day lying in a forest and lying on my stomach and digging a hole with my hands in the sand to get my head down and to try to get away from searching fire that they were trying to get to us. This was very fortunately the day that the Russians overwhelmed us and drove the Germans off.
Now near where your BTO and the ETO crashed, there's a B-17 monument there.
Yes, this is a monument that is a full-sized raised platform in the area where our plane went down. It's a black finished pavement that represents the shadow of the bombers going to Russia. And the Polish people gathered money and had a model of a B-17 rudder to mount on top of this platform as representing the remnant of the bomber. And this was dedicated in July of year 2000. The man that designed this wonderful being a retired architect, I can appreciate it. The man that designed it was a 20-year-old soldier alongside the rest of us in 1944. And fortunately, he lived to see his work completed.
Well, that's real interesting. Is there anything else that comes to mind you'd like to add?
Just not really. One time, just a kind of in war there has to be humor. One day we were all sitting out in our underwear, sunning ourselves alongside this farmhouse, and my pilot was from El Paso, Texas, and his pseudonym, everybody had a pseudonym, was Cowboy. And they had these beautiful cavalry horses, unbelievable how they were trained to behave under fire and not bolt or startle. And they wanted Lou to ride this horse, and Lou begged off, and he couldn't raise his arm up even to his mouth even, and so he says, but my navigator Al worked as a kid in a place where people paid money to ride horseback for. He exercised horses in the off season. He'll ride it. Well, I got on the horse. I couldn't refuse my pilot. I got on the horse bareback with a rope bridle. The horse didn't understand English, and I didn't know any Polish. And everything was fine until he decided to bolt, and he ran through an orchard of small plum trees. Well, if you've ever picked plums, you know that there are a lot of little thorns on the trees, and I was pretty well scratched up. But everybody got a laugh out of it except me, so I guess it was worth.
Well, you're having your laugh now, Alfred. Hey, that was a nice interview. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, fellas. I appreciate it. I really do. Like I say, I do have this two-part printed story from the Confederate Air Force Dispatch magazine. If you would like a copy of it, I have it here at the hotel, sure. And I'll give it to you tomorrow.
Okay,
And,
yes,
you gonna be around tomorrow?
I'll buy one from you.
Oh, no, this is just a Xerox copy. My goodness. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, gentlemen.
What was your pilot's name? Louis what?
Louis Hernandez, Hernandez.
Thank you.
He's one.
We're speaking with Clayton David of Hannibal, Missouri now. He was a co-pilot in a B-17. The B-17's name was the Wolfhound, and Clayton brought his beautiful wife Scotty with him, and she with us in here to Wichita Falls, and he is one of the very favorite folks around here. On the third mission over Oscarsleben, 11 January 1944, you ran into a little bit of trouble. Tell us about it.
Well, first of all, that was to be a maximum effort, and we put up about everything we had, and we were expecting fighter cover all the way, one of the early missions for that. But we were already under attack. I was with the 303rd Bomb Group, and that's the 1st Division. We were already under attack when the mission was recalled because of weather moving in on the bases of England. But being under attack, we went ahead, naturally. And we had 2.5 hours of solid fighter attack. We lost, first of all, we lost our number 3 engine got shot out. And about the time we approached the target, we lost a 2nd engine. We did make our bomb run, and on the way back then, we still had our outboard engines, and we kept dropping down in altitude to stay under the group for protection. But finally, and the fight continued, with the fighters, and it finally happened that we were back over about the Zuider Zee territory. We had dropped down from 25,000 feet to 15,000, still expecting to make England, which we would have done with 2 outboard engines. And they made another pass, and they set our number 2 gas tank on fire. The first pilot ordered bailout, and so I proceeded through the normal bailout procedure, and I went down to the escape hatch. And when I got down there, the navigator was gone, but the bombardier was still there. And I said, "Hey, you should have been gone before me." And he said, "I'll follow you, go ahead." So I jumped, and I jumped in the normal fashion that I got off the ground, would have gotten out of the plane on the ground. And that is the lower escape hatch reaching across with the escape hatch gone and hanging on, and then dropping out, which I did, and thank goodness I had checked a couple of things. I looked at the cloud cover below because we were above clouds. We couldn't see anything. And I estimated the top of the clouds to be about 3,000 feet. So I made up my mind I would go into the cloud cover before I pulled my parachute, the ripcord. And and this I did. But the thing that helped me was only a few days before we had had a briefing at our base by a British paratrooper. And he told us one of the things, he said, "Hey, wait a minute. Don't worry about a falling sensation. There is none. When you go out of an airplane, the first thing's going to happen, you're going to roll like a ball. Stretch your arms and legs out as far as you can, and that'll stop that. And then you're in control." And this was exactly what happened. And so the jump turned out to be just the way he said. When I went into the clouds, I pulled my ripcord, I pulled my handle, and the parachute opened. At the same instant it opened, it popped out below the clouds. So I was probably lower than I thought I would be, and all that I could see was water. And I looked around, and of course I was the only man coming down, and I had less than 500 feet. And he had told us, he said, "If you want to guide your parachute, pull the ripcords down in the direction you want to go." And so this I did, because I spotted a little strip of land. And it turned out that strip of land was about 40 feet wide, 40 yards wide, and it was between the Zuider Zee and the Kingsmere Lake, just at the city limits of Amsterdam. And I hit that dike. I hit the only spot I could have. And so as quick as I landed, the first thing I did was get out of my parachute, get out of my May West, and fortunately that day I was flying with my flight boots on over my regular GI shoes because it wasn't supposed to be quite so cold that day. And so I got out of my parachute and my May West and all, and I threw those in the water, and nothing was really happening. They weren't sinking. I threw them in the lake. And so then I took my flight boots off, and I filled those with water, and I chucked those in on top of the May West and the parachute. They sank, and I eliminated the evidence of my being there, and those in my follow-up visits back, those were never found. And quick as I was on the ground, and I looked, and here's some of my crew members coming through the clouds. They were going into the water, and I could hear the German boats starting up to go out and pick people up. I had no place to go except one of two directions because of water on two sides. And just at that time, I looked up, and there was a man riding a bicycle down that dike, a little black strip, and he pointed. And I went in the direction that he pointed. And I ran about, I don't know, a quarter of a mile or so, and I got away from the lake area and saw an open field. And then I ran out in the open field, and I laid down in the open field in a drainage ditch. And I had a summer flight suit on, so that kept me pretty well hidden. Now that I've been back there and so forth, if I had have gone the opposite direction, I would have walked right into the little village of Durgar Dam and automatically been arrested. But fortunately, I was not. Thanks to this man who I never knew who he was, but he pointed a direction for me to go. I believed him, I trusted him. Well, it was kind of funny hiding because over at a farmhouse I could see some people walking around and looking and watching and so forth, and they saw me, but I hid anyhow. And this was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The thing that I decided I would do was cold. January 11, you know, lying in a water ditch. And I found that if I got in a certain position, I could keep getting too wet. And I could tolerate it. So I decided I'll wait till it's dark enough before I move. Well, before I thought it was dark enough to move, a man from the farmhouse came out and came close to where he thought I was. Well, I knew he was looking for me. So finally I raised my head up and popped it back down, so then he called me over, and his only question was American. And I said yes, and he motioned for me to stay put. Then the dogs were barking and so forth up at the house, so he went back to check to see what was going on up there, and came back, and that motioned me to follow him, which I did, and I quickly learned why they wear wooden shoes. We were walking in about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of water out through that field. He had dry feet with the wooden shoes. I had the leather shoes. I didn't do so well. But anyway, on the way up, why a couple of different times was motion, and he had just signaled for me to hit the dust. And back into that water I'd go. Well, finally we got to the house, the farmhouse. He walked me in behind the cows, and the women were sitting in there milking cows. And then we went into the kitchen, which adjoined the milk barn. And when I got into the kitchen, they offered then to take some of my wet clothes and put them in the oven. This I did. And I'd worn an electrical flying suit. And hey, that thing was sopped. And of course it never did dry out. But anyhow, a man that spoke excellent English started to interrogate me. And I gave him only the name, rank, and serial number bit. And then he started the sales lingo that I should surrender. The war wouldn't last much longer. The Red Cross was getting food into the POW camps. All of this. And I went through the whole rigmarole, and after it was getting dark, and finally I just got up and headed for the oven and started to take out my flight suit, which had dried some. And I said, if you're not going to help me, don't hinder me. And that's all he needed, was an assurance that I intended to escape, evade. And so he called 2 young men in, and they then took me out into a field. We walked alongside of a canal, got inside of a boat. They rowed across the canal, and they put me in the calf barn for the night. And so that's where things started with the underground. Now, 2 or 3 things happened. Number one, I have since learned that the young man who came to the field and got me had a brother who was serving in the German army. I knew that the man who interrogated me was a professional. It turned out he was a German working for the Reuter News Service in Holland, and he had become impressed with the people of Holland, and they finally let him join them in the resistance movement. So that's why I got a professional interrogation. He has since died, but his son was a school teacher in Durgerdam at the outside of Amsterdam. We've met him and many
Know their
countries.
names?
Yes, yeah. The name was Wolf, W-O-L-F-F. And the interesting thing, that happens to be my maternal grandmother's maiden name, and she was from Germany, but I knew nothing about it at that time. They told me very quickly. They said, we think everybody off of your crew survived except one man, and they described it, and it was the bombardier, which I didn't recognize at the time, but the bombardier hadn't jumped for fear of failure. So when he did jump, he executed exactly what he was afraid of. He never did pull his ripcord. And they thought all the rest of the men survived. And it turned out later that 3 of the men were reported as killed in action, and they were sure at the time I was there that they had survived. I never know the answer to that, whether they were executed, drowned, or what did happen. But they kept telling me that they were sure everybody had survived except the bombardier. Well, anyhow, they got me some. The next day, the 2 young men came back very early before daylight and took me from my location. They wanted me that night in a location I could be where if the Germans found me, I would say I got there on my own. It was in a barn with some young calves and so forth. So that was a cold, wet night, but being a farm boy, I figured out how to cover up some hay and how to take off those wet shoes and put them underneath of a heifer that was lying down and all that kind of stuff. And so the next day then they took me some little distance into a town, and I believe that happens to be a location close to Durgerdam, and they gave me breakfast and then put me in a boat and took me out to a house on an island where I spent the day. And then they came back when I came back that night and got me. But they didn't forget me. A man came, and it turned out to be one of the 2 boys I've learned since and didn't know. But one of the 2 that had helped me got in a boat and brought me a lunch while I was out on the island. And then they came back after dark when I'm dead and got me and took me ashore. And there I was given an old Mackinaw from the dairy barn to put on to cover up, and 2 people from out of Amsterdam were there, a man and a wife, and their bicycles, and then they gave me another bicycle to ride, and I followed behind them into their home in Amsterdam. And I spent a couple of days with them, and then was transferred to a house in Amsterdam to stay for 17 days while they were setting things up so that I could be moved along the line. And the man that helped me was a barber, man and his wife. He was a barber, and I've since learned that he was a barber for many of the board of directors of the local Netherlands bank. And so together some people found clothing and sent it to the house for me to have a fairly decent set of a suit and so forth to wear when I left. Not everybody was that lucky. And after 17 days, then a young man came and got me and took me by train and we went to Venlo, Holland. And then at Venlo, we got off that train for the night. And that's you make so many mistakes, and you wonder how you live through them. Of course, they had made up a fake passport for me, which I had. And in this matter, we were never accustomed to. You know, here in this country, you don't get on a train and go very far unless you produce a ticket. And over there, you turn the ticket in at the end of the trip. Quite a different thing. And it was night in Venlo. We were getting off the train, and this guy was walking ahead of me. We walked down the exit, and gosh, I was within 10 feet of the German guard, and I had my fake passport in my hand when I realized all he was doing was taking up tickets. Well, I didn't want to, at that time, start fishing for a ticket in my pocket. So I did the most brazen thing I could think of, is I put that passport in my hand, flashed it in front of his eye, and walked right on. And it so happened that apparently they had so many people, Germans and so forth, riding trains with passports and official passes and so on. He must have thought I was an official. I went right through. And so I spent that night in Venlo, and that night a lady came in and met me, and that's Yoka Fulmer. And very lovely lady, is the dearest of friends, and we've seen many, many times. And Yoka interrogated me that night in Venlo and gathered some information to verify my identity. And then the next day she came back and picked me up and took me by train from Venlo to Maastricht, Holland. And at Maastricht, we met two other gentlemen. One of them was Shack Fry, and Shack's been to many of our reunions, same as Yoka has. And Shack was, at that time, he was working in rationing of petrol for the Germans. Occasionally he'd have to be absent from work, and he was lining up safe houses for people to go to. So Shack and his friend Schmidt met Yoka and me at the train station in Maastricht, and then Shack and Schmitz took me across the bridge over into the other section of Maastricht, and there I stayed with a butcher for several days, and the butcher was in business with his brother, and they had the butcher shop and all downstairs, and we lived upstairs. And there were several interesting things happening there, but one thing of kind of interest is his brother, in selling meat and so forth, had been on a train, and he was coming back, and he had to come in and tell me the story that he had seen two German pilots on the train carrying their parachutes back, and they had been shot down, and they were complaining about what good airplanes the Americans had and what difficult it was to compete. But I thought it was interesting. They had been shot down, but they were carrying their parachutes back to base. I'd been shot down, and I was trying to get out of the country. And then we went from, I went from Maastricht to Belgium, crossed over first into Belgium, and then met up with some other people. We went to Brussels. In Brussels, we were there several days and met the most unforgettable character of my life, but I don't know that he was a true supporter, and don't know to this day because I've never been able to identify him. I do know the man said he went to school in Oklahoma. He was born in Holland. He had lived in Germany, and his English was American. And he defied anybody to detect an accent in his English, Dutch, German, or French. In addition to that, he spoke Spanish. And what a character he was. And I know he met us in a restaurant, 6 of us in a restaurant, and we went into Brussels by La Gare Nord, the north side of Brussels, and went to a restaurant and spent the day. And then that evening, he escorted us after dark on a streetcar across town to a safe house. Now, all I know is that when we got on the streetcar and it was dark and the little security islands had the lights on and so forth, we got on the streetcar and it was overloaded. We could barely find a place in the platform. Some of us were standing on the steps. And this guy got on the steps and he was hanging out so far on the steps on the streetcar that he knocked one of those security lights off and handed the conductor money, and in plain English said, "Give me 7 of the best." And what a character he was. He later is the same man that took us to Paris 4 at a time, because we met 2 more men in Brussels, so we ended up with 8. And then 4 before he took us to Paris. But there's always been a question about him, and I've never been able to identify for sure who he was. He wore German boots and said he got them off from a German he'd killed. And so he was that kind of a fellow. In Paris, we went into Paris early of a morning and caught in La Gare North in Paris, got off of the train, and the guide took 4 of us. 4 others he'd already taken down, and he took the 4 of us in to the underground, and we went out a ways into Paris and got off and went to a school. Incidentally, I haven't contacted anybody else that quite did this, but the way we rode the train from Brussels to Paris, we got to the Belgium-France border, we got off of the train, we had fake passports, and each of us was carrying a little suitcase. And I know, for example, I was supposed to be a deaf and dumb baker working in northern France. And we went through the customs office. We went through customs as we went from Belgium into Paris, France. And not too many people I've ever encountered did that, but they had some kind of a brazen setup. And in Paris, we got out to a school. The 4 men were already there, and we joined them as 4. And this was in a school, in a church school. And they end up as a whole block of school, church, and so forth in the central point. And we had just gotten inside the school, and at that time they generated their own electricity with generators in the basement of the school. And they took us down there and through the generator room and then put us into a stairwell, a concrete stairwell. And that's where we were being hidden. And the janitor was summoned, and the Germans were there in that building. The Germans insisted that he escort them through the building, which he did. And at the level above where we were, he came to the door that, if opened, would come down to that stairwell. And the door was locked, it was a sealed door, and it had on it a sign that in English transmits into danger, high voltage, danger of death. They did not make him unlock that door. What they were looking for was they had traced a typewriter to that school that had been used in making false papers. So they knew that the search was on, and so when they left, then the senior priest came and the janitor came and they got us out of that location and moved us to a high spot in a church building. And luckily enough, we had been, because the Germans came back that afternoon and made the janitor unlock the door and search the building. I was there in '85 and searched for that location and couldn't find it, but I had minimal help from the people in that school. In 1995, I was back. There was a lady superintendent in the school. She got very interested in what I was looking for and sent for the maintenance man to go over the different places with me, which I did, and we didn't find it. And I didn't want to give up, and finally the maintenance man said, electrician might know more places than I do. So we got the electrician, and we started out, and not too far from the entrance that we had used going into that building was this door. And no generating taking place or anything like that. The building completely renovated, but that door was still there with that sign on it. These men took that sign off of that door, was just put on the screws, took it to the superintendent. She then put it in an envelope and wrote the translation on the front of the envelope, and they came out and gave it to me. So I have it as I have it as a souvenir.
How did you get repatriated?
I went into Spain, and then in Spain I was interned.
Through the Pyrenees?
Yeah, I walked over the Pyrenees.
Oh.
Yeah.
Tell us about that a little bit.
Okay, because we were almost captured in Paris, and Ken Shaver and 8 of us, we broke up in pairs. Ken Shaver and I traveled most of the distance from Paris clear down into south central France on our own, on trains, dumb as could be, and got away with it. And then finally got with a group of the Maquis. And the Maquis then, and we stayed some time down in a home in central France. And finally with the Maquis, and the Maquis then had a contact, and so a man and a woman came out to their camp, and their camp received the parachute drops at night and stuff like that. So we were up to the top of the mountain and saw all their hideouts and all of that stuff. We thought we were going to get involved in a drop, but 2 different times it was announced at noon and canceled before the evening setup. But anyhow, that's what they did, and then they distributed them from there. Well, anyway, two people come out, a man and a woman, one Sunday, and got us and took us into Toulouse by train. And then from Toulouse, we left just a night in Toulouse, and we headed on through Pau and out to Orléans Sainte Marie, which is southwest of Pau. And there we got off of the train, and all this time on the train, Ken Shaver and I were riding with the lady. The man was other places riding as lookout on all of this. And once we got off of the train at Sainte Marie Orléans, then we were met by a car, and they took us out into the countryside a distance, and then they had what was set up as forbidden zones. And nobody went into the foot of the mountains and so forth, except the people that lived there. So they could only take us so far, and at that point then, we met a guide. And there were 4 of us who met this guide. And Ken Shaver and myself, a French courier, and his job was to drop into France and deliver money or information and then get out back to England, and he was on his 3rd trip. The 4th person was a Spaniard, and he had deserted Spain during their civil war and went into France and wanted to go home. I saw him exchange money with the guide. So he had to pay his own way. The resistance had the money to take care of the rest of us, I guess. Now, I never knew much about how this guide was recruited or anything about it, but I did learn, I've since learned, that the man that was helping me, he was Basque. He was born in that Basque territory. His father still lived there, and his father is the one that recruited the guide. And so we spent we spent a couple of nights just walking the fence rows, going through the forbidden territory, getting up to where we could start a mountain climb. And we started a mountain climb then one night, and we climbed all night. And most treacherous and trusted I can ever believe. And we climbed all night, and about daylight, well, it wasn't daylight yet, and we broke into a little opening, and they put us in a shed. And we spent the day in the shed. Then the next night, as quick as it was dark, they came back, and the guide took us, and we made our final mountain climb. And we started out in the clouds and so forth. And this was in April, it was the middle of April. And we started our climb. Finally, we climbed high enough that we broke out of the clouds and we were in the moonlight. And by that time, we were getting into pretty deep snow. And we stopped in the guide would stop periodically, but after all, the climb became so stressful that at one of our stops, the Spaniard wasn't going to go on. Well, we didn't want to leave him on the mountain. There wasn't anything else to do with him. And luckily enough, the only thing I'd saved out of my escape kit were 2 benzarine pills. And so I took one of these benzarine pills, and with melted snow in my hand, gave it to the Spaniard, and Ken Shaver and I split the other one. And after a few minutes, we got the Spaniard on his feet, and we made it to the top of the mountain. And once you made it to the top of the mountain, you could see the divide. And one side was France, and the other side was Spain. And so the guide at that point told us, he said, "You're on your own, that's Spain. And there is a sheep hutter's hutch down there if you want to go into it." He said, "I have to get off the mountain before daylight." And so he turned to go home, and at the time we were into the edge of Spain, as far as Ken and I was concerned, our objective and mission might be different than the others. So the other 2, I think, stopped into the sheep herder's cabin. We felt we could do it, and we kept going. We started down the mountain, and the first thing you know, you've got a little valley, a little trickle of water, and the trickle keeps a little bigger. And if you keep growing, you eventually run into a stream. And so we finally were pretty well down to the bottom of the mountain, and there wasn't much snow on the south side of the mountain. And we were pretty well down, and just at daylight, we walked into a little village, nobody up or anything, and so we just kept walking and walked on through the town. And by the time we got to the next town, they knew us. We were there, and the Spanish gendarmes met us and arrested us at this town. And we were pretty lucky. They kept us in a little prison cell there until a bus came by. And then they gave us 2 guides, armed guides. And this bus that came by, all the seats in this old bus were taken by the local people. On top of the bus were the chicken crates and stuff like that. And so that's where we had to go. So we got up on top of the bus, and these two Spaniards riding shotgun. And so that's the way we left that area. And we went a good many miles, and then we got off, and then a better bus came by, and we got on that bus and went into Pamplona. And in Pamplona, things had been arranged, and Ken was enlisted. He was put in a holding facility at the edge of town. We officers were permitted to go and come as long as we stayed in town. And so the next day, after getting in at night, the next day, I was notified to call such a number, and that was the embassy in Madrid. And so they then, at that embassy in Madrid, they wanted to know who I was and where I come in, and so forth, and who was with me. I gave them all the information. They came back in a few hours with a telephone call, and they said, well, Lieutenant David, you check out all right, but how about this Sergeant Schaefer? Where did you meet him? And I said, well, I met him in Brussels. Did you ever know him before? I said, no, I never did. And they said, how much time have you spent with him? I told him a number of weeks. They said, any question in your mind about him being an American? And I said, not one bit. He is just as North Carolinian as he could be. And I said, what's the problem? And they said, well, according to the Red Cross, he's dead. Well, I began to put two and two together,